Something too precise to be coincidence moves through a life the moment someone who once walked away reappears without warning. That message was never the point, not the words they chose, not the hour it landed, not the nostalgia offered up like an explanation. The notification isn't an opening for conversation, it's a dispatch from an exiled province dressed like longing when it's really just a perimeter test. Here's what's actually unfolding beneath that small, ordinary ping. In attachment theory and relational psychology, this has a clinical name: hoovering, a systemic attempt by an emotionally dysregulated person to re-establish control and siphon validation after a long silence. The one reaching out hasn't healed. Their internal instability just pushed them to find an easy emotional fuel source, and the nervous system remembered where one used to live. That distinction matters more than most people let themselves sit with. There's no sincerity in it. It operates the way a heartbeat does, below conscious intention, beneath anything you could call reflection. When the other supply lines falter, the contact comes. Not because of genuine feeling, because the well ran dry somewhere else. Now consider what happens if there's a reply, even a gracious one. Even something measured and warm and thoroughly boundaried. That single response re-establishes a two-way connection. The elevated field, the one built through detachment, through the slow, quiet labor of healing, becomes available again. They draw from it to steady their own chaotic internal weather. What looked like kindness from the inside is structurally being tapped. The tether isn't poetic. It's a mechanism. And a reply is what unlocks it. There's a heavier layer. One most people sidestep because it asks something of them. The former social web carries no claim on the present. Another person's emptiness isn't your deficit to fill. There's no obligation to provide closure, to host forgiveness conversations, or to grant access to people who left during the wilderness years. But the refusal itself has mechanics that rarely get named. When the ping arrives and the answer is silence, something shifts in the shared field, whether or not anyone witnesses it. The colleague who schedules coffee to catch up, the relative who forwards an old photograph with a note about simpler times. The former partner who mentions a dream, who says a face wouldn't leave their mind. Every one of them was once close enough to drain the field. Every one of them, without exception, is testing whether the old door still opens. What no one explains is why the silence in those 72 hours that follow feels different from ordinary quiet, heavier, more deliberate, as though something is being decided just outside the visible frame. And just beyond that stillness lies what the field does when the door stays shut. Capable, functional, often successful. That's what other people see when they watch your life from the outside. The stability you built, the boundaries you installed, the cleanliness of the field you now occupy. And on paper, every one of those observations is true. But here's what the observer never sees. They don't see the half-second pause before you open a message, the way your thumb hovers, the small interior alarm that flies before your conscious mind has even registered who the sender is. They don't see the cost of the boundary you're holding, because boundaries that hold are quiet, and quiet things are invisible. That gap is where you've been living. Not in the life other people described when they talk about you. In the space just behind it. Slightly off. Watching your own days from a step behind, like a passenger who's been handed the wheel but not the map, and you felt that gap become unbearable at specific moments. The time signature of a message that arrives in the dark. The name that appears and makes your chest tighten before you've read a single word. The manufactured crisis designed to bypass your discernment through your oldest reflex. The one that says fix it, save them, respond. The counterfeit apology that arrives years late, vague and weightless, engineered to clear their conscience without ever touching the structural truth of what was done. You've held your ground through those moments. You've done the impossible thing. You've watched the notification sit there, and you haven't answered. Let me name what actually happened in that refusal, because no one in your life has named it for you. When you declined to respond, you didn't merely protect your peace. You enforced a physical law, resonance displacement, the principle that when a high-density field refuses contact with a lower one, the lower field must reorganize. It can't sustain itself as it was. Their system registered the vacuum your silence created, and it had to find another source. That's the mechanics we rarely discuss. The response you almost gave, the polite, measured, entirely reasonable reply, would have been the key in the lock. You declined that key. And in declining, you did something more than refuse a conversation. You declined to participate in the transaction altogether. You declined to confirm that their reach still had meaning. The reach depended on your response to exist at all. Without it, the gesture collapsed into a dead signal, unanswered and unregistered by any system that mattered. That isn't small. That's the entire war, because here's what the casual observer misses about the three intrusions. The casual ping and the manufactured crisis and the counterfeit apology aren't three different events. They're one single automated sequence, run by a system that has only one program: check the pipe, test the seal, reclaim the supply. It isn't personal. It isn't even conscious. It's the same mechanical hunger that pulls a moth toward a lit window, repeated in the language of human emotion because that's the only dialect the lower field knows how to speak. You didn't recognize it because you kept hearing sincerity. It was never sincere, and this is the part that reframes everything. You aren't being cruel by refusing. You're being correct. The quarantine barrier isn't a punishment you're inflicting on them, it's a law you're finally obeying. The exiled province doesn't require your visitation to survive. It requires your absence to release its claim. So you've held the line. You haven't responded. And now you're waiting, in the specific silence that follows a refusal, wondering if the cost was worth it. There's a marker that appears when the perimeter has actually held. A signpost that confirms the boundary is real and not merely postponed. It will be named here, but something will be withheld first, because the signpost only means what it means when you understand what follows it. That marker is the threefold confirmation. First, you see the notification, the name, the preview, the little dread rising, and you feel nothing. Not anger. Not anxiety. Not the old pull. A deep, sudden emotional neutrality, like a river that has finally stopped flooding and simply runs. That is the first sign the pipeline is dead. Your system produced no voltage because there is nothing left to receive. Second, within 72 hours, the attempts cease. The pings stop, the messages stop arriving. Not because they finally respect you, but because the automated sequence has confirmed the pipe is closed and moved on to other supply lines. The silence that follows is not abandonment, it is proof of completion. Third, the master sequence begins to appear. 777, Divine Perimeter Defense. And paired with it, 999, Absolute Finality, Closed Chapters. You will see these numbers in places that feel like coincidence, and they are not coincidence. They are the signature of the boundary you refused to break. But there is one more component of the confirmation that most people never look at, because it requires sitting inside the silence they worked so hard to create. The part about what the pause after the threefold confirmation is actually for, and what it prepares. That will come next, and when it does, the marker will reveal itself as the arrival point, the threshold, the doorway. Because that silence you are sitting in, it was never an emptiness you had to endure. It was the room you built for what comes next. And just beyond that lies the life everyone else sees, and the one running underneath it, waiting to be walked through. The two lives are still walking together. The one that shows up on time, remembers names, answers before anyone has to ask twice. And the one underneath, the one that carries the weight no photograph has ever caught, the one that runs its quiet excavation in the hours when everything else goes still. That friction between them is not a flaw, it is the most honest architecture a person can carry, and then a name appears on a screen. The upper life holds its shape, it always does. The lower life flinches just slightly, just enough to feel the seam between who you became and who you used to be when that person had access to you. Before the steadiness catches, something has to be pressed back down. That press is invisible from outside. It registers as nothing, but the cost of it is real. What the cost produces is a particular kind of exhaustion, not the kind that comes from a long day, but the kind that lives in the jaw and the shoulders and the back of the skull. The kind that arrives from holding two lives upright at once, one that the world sees fully formed, one that only you carry, and the quiet labor of making both of them appear to weigh the same. That exhaustion is not a malfunction. It is the record of the load, the evidence that the boundary was not theoretical, it was enforced, it was maintained, and the maintaining of it asked something from the body every single time. The people who held nothing and refused nothing and simply let everything through do not carry that particular weight. The weight belongs to those who stood in the gap. And yet, the doubt arrives. It always arrives, not the small version, the one easily dismissed, but the one that deserves a real answer. The doubt that asks whether the boundary was ever a boundary at all, or whether it was simply pride made structural, bitterness that learned to dress itself in quieter language. The closed door that should have remained open, sealed now by unresolved anger calling itself strength. That doubt is serious. It should be taken seriously. Because the people who once stood on the other side of that boundary are extraordinarily skilled at suggesting, through absence and then sudden reappearance, that the line itself was always the offense, that the refusal was the wound. That if there were no wound in the one who left, there would have been no departure. But the doubt cannot be answered with suppression. It cannot be answered with a shrug. It has to be answered with evidence. When a person who once drew from another individual's energy, labor, and emotional grounding finds that supply removed, their nervous system registers the absence, not as grief for the specific person, as deficit. As the loss of an easy source of fuel, the return is never an apology wearing the shape of outreach. It is a pressure test, a measurement of how much resistance remains in the structure that once held them, and what that test reveals is not whether you have healed, but whether you have grown tired enough to let them back in. The contact that arrives after months of silence was not born of reflection. It was not born of genuine memory or sincere return. It was a perimeter test, nothing more than a signal fired low along the wire to see if the fence still hums. And here, in that understanding, the question the doubt was asking finally finds its answer, not as a triumph, but as a calm recognition. The friction felt when that name appeared on the screen was not a sign that something is broken. It was the sensation of a line still holding. The exhaustion was the toll of the refusal. The silence was not the sound of error. It was the sound of the line still drawn, and just beyond that quiet, in the space where the understanding settles, lies the question of who initiated that contact, and why the timing of it was never as accidental as it appeared. The boundary did not arrive with anger, it arrived with evidence. The decision to sever those ties was not born of offense but of exhaustion, the slow, cumulative realization that the relationship was a drain and not a source. The fatigue carried in the body is the proof the choice was correct. The doubt does not tell the whole story. It fails to mention the arithmetic it never learned to read. What remains after a subtraction is not always a loss. When a force that once pulled at you daily goes quiet, the stillness that follows is not an absence of something owed. It is the daily ledger finally balancing in your favor. That emptiness, the one that masquerades as loneliness, is actually the first clear breath taken in years. That refusal, that silence, that held line, it is not a wound being nursed. It is a structure fully finished, and the one who built it is still standing inside, wondering when it became home. The intention was to build an absence. A barrier against intrusion, but maybe the real construction was the one room no one ever gave you. The room that was always supposed to hold this person, alone, attended to, finally safe. The exhaustion you carried wasn't the price of a wrong choice, it was the labor of building the right room. And now the question you've been saving arrives, because it couldn't land before you understood what had actually been built. What do you do with that room, now that it's finally complete? You built it with bare hands, brick by refusal. But have you actually stood in it yet? Not the idea of it. Not the pride of holding the line. Have you entered the finished room, and let it hold you in return? That's the door you've been guarding from the outside. The boundary was never the destination. It was the threshold. And just beyond it sits another question, one about who reached out, and why the timing of it was never as accidental as it seemed. Because most people never go inside. They build the boundary and keep standing outside it, guarding a door they're too afraid to enter. They hold the perimeter and never once step in to see what the silence is actually for. That's where you are now. The boundary is held. The pings have stopped. The neutrality has settled. The threefold confirmation has done its work. You know the quarantine holds because you feel nothing when their name surfaces. And now there's a strange, quiet emptiness where the fight used to be. You don't miss them. You never will again. But the purpose of the space hasn't revealed itself yet. It's not a holding cell, it's not a punishment, it's not even a sanctuary, not yet. It's a foundation. And foundations aren't built to be admired, they're built to carry weight. So here's the question I've been keeping from you. It was saved for last because it wouldn't land until the perimeter was proven, until the neutrality had been felt. The attempts had stopped, and the 7s and 9s had shown up in your path. Now that the proof is in, the thing underneath can finally be named. Not them, never them again. Someone you haven't met yet, or someone you've known your whole life whose access you never actually gave them. Because the door you've been guarding was never only about keeping people out. Every boundary has two directions, and the one you haven't walked through yet, the image that keeps returning, the one carried for exactly this moment, is that perimeter test, the one you read like a love letter, the one that started all of this. You passed that test, you held the line. But now the test has changed. The perimeter is no longer something you defend from the outside, it's something you inhabit. That's your next step. Not more walls. Not another refusal. The test is over. The marker has come. The room is built. Not another refusal. The test is over. The marker has come. The room is built.